Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm Scott Bolahan, founder of the Twin Bill. It was 121 years ago today that the New York Highlanders played their first game. In 1913, that club would become known as the Yankees. However you feel about the Yankees, the history of baseball would look very different without them. I was just on the fantastic podcast Baseball Bucket List, where I talked about being a Yankee Stadium tour guide and coaching high school baseball in Manhattan, among many other things. On my tours, I always say New York baseball history has become American history. While I think New York is a basketball town, especially when the Knicks are not terrible like right now, I have some hope for the future of the perpetually dying sport. This season, at the Lower Manhattan high school I coach at, I had twice the number of kids as usual come out for tryouts, and this is in spite of us having to take a boat to get to our practices. So I was particularly excited to talk to Kevin Baker about his new book, The New York Game, which proves what us New Yorkers and ESPN have always known, that New York City is the center of the baseball world. The book is phenomenal, full of rich stories about the game's origin up until Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. Even for someone like me who knows about baseball in New York professionally, I learned so much. I hope you enjoy our chat. I know I did. Today, my guest is Kevin Baker. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. It's a great day for an interview. Let's do two.
So, you grew up in Massachusetts. How does this book happen?
Well, the key is born in New Jersey, born in Englewood. And by the time we moved up to Massachusetts, I was 9 years old and already a Yankees fan. So, and it was the impossible dream summer, 1967, the great Red Sox summer. So I had to put up with that. But, who knows, I might have become a Red Sox fan, but they called my favorite ball player Mickey Mantle, and that was an unacceptable insult. So I stayed a Yankees fan. My father took me to the original Yankee Stadium, the Great Palace, to see Mantle play. And my favorite uncle took me to see Willie Mays play at Shea Stadium. So I got to see the two of them in about a week. And that was a great introduction to the game. And it stuck.
How long have you been working on this for?
This is a labor of love. It took talk about a lifetime of something. It seems like it took about that for this book. My editor, Andrew Miller, first had the idea about 25 years ago. And I've written several other books in that time. I was under contract for some and to, kind of keep home and hearth together. But it really has been that long. And I turned in this outrageously long manuscript and just kind of horrified the good people at Knopf. But they were very good about it, and they decided to cut it in half. And so this is the first book, goes from about 1823 through 1945. And then the second book starts with the breaking of the color barrier with Jackie Robinson, and that goes from 45 to now, and it will be out in the spring of 2026.
So obviously, we're into baseball literature. What are some of the books that you read in your research?
Oh, I stand on the shoulders of giants. There's so much great baseball writing. Baseball is really the writing sport in our country. There's so many people whose work I've loved. Roger Angell, of course, you can't go wrong with him at all. John Thorne, great stuff about the early game. Jonathan Schwartz has maybe the best short book about what it is to be a fan. All kinds of people. George Will, Nicky Davidoff, Alan Barra, Bill James in the statistical variety, Jane Levy, those terrific books about Koufax and Mantle and Ruth. Lee Montville with a great Ruth book.
Yeah, amazing.
There's my library overfloweth and threatens to crash into the neighbors downstairs. When I was doing the As Told To book with Reggie Jackson,
right.
Trying to get him to talk a little more. Very smart guy, taught me a lot about the game, a lot of things. But I read to him this whole passage from Angel talking about his World Series in 77 and 78. He listened intently and he says, "Yeah, that's it, Kevin, write something like that." And I said, then I'm going to go, paint like Rembrandt and compose music like Gershwin, sure. It's just the best in the game. That'll be easy.
That's really great. So I want to go all the way back to the beginning here to, the beautiful pastoral fields of Cooperstown, New York, where Abner Doubleday picks up a ball, he puts down a base right next to the Hall of Fame, right? So what really happens here?
Well, this is the thing. We're determined, like as with many things in America, we're determined to think of the country as the real America. And it's not. I love the town of Cooperstown, beautiful town. I love going to the Hall of Fame, been there a couple times. But Abner Doubleday had nothing to do with starting baseball. Abner Doubleday was sort of the Forrest Gump of the 19th century. He was around when almost anything happened, knew everybody. He used to correspond with Ralph Waldo Emerson. He read Sanskrit. He was at Fort Sumter when the first shot of the Civil War landed not far from his head. He cited the first Union shot back. He rose to be a major general, commanded a regiment of all black troops, held the line at Gettysburg, went back to Gettysburg with Lincoln for the Gettysburg Address, was badly wounded twice, went to the White House with Mrs. Lincoln for seances, was a bibliophile, did all kinds of, had the first cable car franchise in San Francisco. He was always on hand whenever anything was going on, but he didn't invent baseball. And the reason he got credit for it seems to have been mostly because when A.G. Spalding of sporting goods fame set up a commission to determine just where baseball came from, Spalding and his wife were theosophists. For those who are not disciples of Madame Blavatsky, theosophy was kind of a popular New Age gobbledygook of beliefs around the time. Doubleday had been president of the Theosophy Society. I love this. It's as if a group of Scientologists decided to try to replace Dr. Naismith with L. Ron Hubbard as the founder of basketball. That's essentially what it came down to. Even Doubleday's best friend in the world, who gave his eulogy, guy named A.G. Mills, admitted that Doubleday never mentioned baseball to him, even though Mills was the president of the National League. It never came up like, that thing you run. I invented that. Nope, never came up. But somehow he invented the game. So, it just doesn't hold up. Who's not in the Hall of Fame? Abner Doubleday, because they can't even, buy the myth up there.
Is there someone that you think should get more credit for their involvement in the creation of the game?
Oh, good question. I do. There's a guy named Doc Adams who should be in the Hall of Fame. He was the first shortstop on the New York Knickerbockers team. The New York Knickerbockers, unlike some other claims, were not the first baseball team ever. They were one of the first in New York. But what they did, and what he did specifically as the secretary for the club, was to consolidate the rules. And these are the rules that became the New York game and evolved into modern baseball. And among other things, the game was first played with kind of a hard rubber ball. You couldn't throw it more than about 200 feet. Doc Adams got very sick of being of kind of constantly having to run out to left field and make relay throws. He went to what he described as a Scotch saddler and got him to make a leather ball, really the first hard ball. Not as hard as it was today, but first hard ball. And this really helped make this a game for adults, make it a tough game, make it something with a little element of death in it, or the possibility of death. And that also was something that happened in New York, the one and only death on a major league ball field with a guy hit by a pitch ball in 1920. So he is a seminal character in it. He also seems to have been a really good guy. He was an abolitionist. He devoted lots of time to a free clinic, and he described his marriage as the crowning achievement of his life. So I think he'd make a fine father of baseball if we have to have just one. Put him in the hall.
That's great. So I've coached high school baseball in the city for the last 6 years. There are so many disadvantages to playing in the city. I mean, we take a ferry to Governor's Island to practice. Why did the game sprout up in New York and not Philly or Boston? What made New York so special?
First of all, baseball really is an urban game. I mean, there's a whole debate going back to when the first game was ever played. I mean, ancient Egyptians played some kind of bat and ball game. Since we got off the savannah, we were doing something like this. But modern baseball was really an urban game. American farms tend to be big. It's hard to get together 18 people for a game. So that's why they started in cities. In New York, there used to be a lot of empty lots as the city expanded up Manhattan. They kept getting filled up with buildings, but for a while there was enough land there for everybody to get together and play this. But yeah, as you say, there were competing games. The Philadelphia game had a circle of stakes you ran to 20 feet apart. There were 11 men in the lineup. You either played 11 innings, getting one man out in each inning, or you played 2 innings, getting all 11 men out in each inning.
Ooh.
And you hit the ball with a kind of short bat called a DeLille. You can imagine how the DeLille went over in Brooklyn. So, that was kind of odd. The big rival was the Massachusetts game, which is much more this running game and absolutely crazy sounding. There's no fair or foul territory. You could turn around, hit the ball behind you if you wanted to. And there were no baseline. The only way to get a batter out was by hitting them with a thrown ball. This sounds like nothing so much to me as a Looney Tunes cartoon. It must have been great fun to see people running everywhere, throwing balls at, but hard to put a stadium around it, hard to make it professional. And that was the sort of thing New York as a city excelled at, taking ideas from anywhere and making them into something that was really going to be a going concern, that you were really going to make money off. And you could put the New York game in a ballpark, charge admission, you could bet on it. Gambling was a big part in baseball's evolution as a professional sport, as a vocation.
So what would an early game look like in New York?
It would be pretty recognizable. At first, you could only pitch underhand, and the batter would tell the pitcher where he wanted the ball. The idea was to, accommodate him in hitting. But that quickly began to change. Pitchers became frustrated with that. So overhand pitching, sidearm pitching, things like the curveball all evolved in New York as well. At first, you could get people out by catching a ball in the first bounce, but that evolved until you had to catch a ball on the fly. But these rules were around pretty early on. They really consolidated them in the 1860s, and the game spread all around the country, horribly enough, due to the Civil War. And the New York game really proved most popular everywhere. It also was very quick. It's hard for us to believe with baseball today, but a lot of people at the time, including the likes of Walt Whitman and Mark Twain, remarked on how fast the game was, and they felt that reflected America. And it was a lot faster. I mean, as late as 1990, there was a National League game that lasted 58 minutes. Wow. Bang, bang. This is before TV, before the batter could step out 45 times, before the pitcher, sort of dawdled around on the mound. The game flew. I think fans would have liked that, too, if they had seen it.
So as you say, you always hear baseball's a reflection of America. It seems like baseball's even more so a reflection of New York City and what was happening politically, geographically in the city as well.
Very, very much so. We think these were all gentlemen clubs, and they weren't. There were a lot of middle-class people playing it. There was a team, the Magnolia, mostly made up of labor. Almost everybody could get together and meet and work and play on the field or in the stands, which was very much how the city was. I say almost, the big exception, and again, horribly, this is a reflection of America and New York. The big exception was people of color. And very early on, there were the continuing and strenuous efforts to segregate the sport. There were 55 known black players, the organized minors or majors, before 1884. But then the color line was really drawn across all organized baseball. And this went on, of course, until Jackie Robinson signed with the Dodgers over 60 years later. So it reflected the city in that way too. But also the game was always very bound up with particularly the political establishment in New York, with the most legendary and powerful of political machines, Tammany Hall. For many years, the owners and the founders of the big three New York teams, the Giants, Dodgers, and Yankees, all had tight Tammany Hall connections. And you had to have that because otherwise you weren't going to be able to build your park. They would run a street through it. You weren't going to be able to function in the city. The very first New York team in a major league, the New York Mutuals, was owned by Boss Tweed and came out of the Mutual Hook and Ladder Company, a fire company where a lot of the political machines evolved from. So this was always tightly wound around the power apparatus of the city.
So when people think about early baseball in New York City, I think people tend to jump right to Babe Ruth. But
yes. Yeah.
I would argue that the first Major League Baseball star was probably Christy Mathewson, I think, is a guy that we all kind of know, but we don't really know who he was. Who was Christy Mathewson?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's there are various stars in the 19th century who are widely popular, but Christy Mathewson took it to a whole other level. And Christy Mathewson was kind of the beau ideal of the time. Grantland Rice said he was the one man who he felt was bigger than the game. He was considered the epitome of sort of rugged Christianity. A Christian, a married man, a good, upstanding Protestant, but somebody who could also get in there and rough it up with the boys. I mean, to this day, there's a depiction of him in a stained glass window in St. John the Divine's Cathedral up on 110th Street. They have one on celebrating sport, and he's the guy for baseball. That's who they would choose. And he sounds like he was an unbearable goody-goody when he first came up. He would say stuff like, if a man would cheat on his wife, maybe he'd, betray his country too, and initially his teammates couldn't stand him. He very quickly made them love him. He would get in there, he would brawl along with them, he would gamble with them, he had that kind of common touch. His manager, who was a completely different character, feisty, hard-drinking John Muggsy McGraw. McGraw and his wife were Irish Catholics. They were Democrats. Mathewson and his wife were Protestant WASPs. Nonetheless, the two couples shared a big apartment in New York for 3 or 4 years. As Frank DeFord wrote about Mathewson, I don't know if this has ever been done before with a star player and his manager. And he proved very able to adapt to the culture around him. And this is an ongoing thing in New York. A superstar comes in, or a would-be superstar comes in. How is he going to get along with the fans, with the media culture, with his teammates? And it really makes life hard for some people who don't adjust well to it, such as A-Rod. Many, though, are able to kind of thread the needle and become beloved. But, Mathewson, very, very dramatic. He would come out, in the Polo Grounds where he played with the Giants. The bullpen was far away in the outfield before the game, wearing this white duster, like a white traveling coat over himself. And the fans would go wild. A very dramatic entrance, kind of like Mariano Rivera coming in to enter Sandman. They just loved him. And he was a great, great pitcher. One of the greatest ever. Defined an era. They called him the Big Six, which was, again, kind of a Tammany connection. The Big Six was Boss Tweed's initial fire engine. The Americas company had a big tiger on it. Big Six meant power, meant unstoppable power in the culture of New York at the time. And that's why they loved him.
I wanted to talk about his teammate, Fred Merkle. And you kind of like, oh, funny little thing that happened. It's really terrible and very tragic, and I didn't realize that until reading the book.
It's horrible. Fred Merkle was involved. It was called. He's benefited by the fact that what it was called is no longer has another connotation. It was called Merkle's boner, and it was the boneheaded play. Big game, 1908 pennant race down the stretch. Cubs, Giants. Merkle gets a key hit as a very young teenage pinch hitter in the ninth inning, and then the next guy gets another hit that wins the game. And as was the established habit for decades, Merkle didn't bother to touch second base running from first, but just ran off to the clubhouse to avoid the fans who were let loose on the field immediately afterwards. Unbeknownst to Merkle, the Cubs second baseman, guy named Johnny Evers, of Tinker to Evers to Chance fame. Odd guy. He could never gain weight. He was always trying to he weighed 125 pounds. And so he would spend nights on the road up in his hotel room eating candy bars and going over the rule book. And Evers had a conversation a few games before with the umpire in the field at the point, Hank O'Day, and had talked to, a similar play with this to O'Day about, hey, this is against the rules. You have to go to the next base for the play to be over and for the game to be over. And so they'd had this conversation, shared it with nobody else. And when Merkle doesn't touch second, Johnny Evers tries to go and retrieve the ball and step on second base. And then there's this huge, crazy scene with the crowd on the field where he's trying to do that. Various Giants are trying to throw the ball on the stands. They retrieve it. He finally steps, Christy Mathewson drags Merkle back out of the clubhouse to step on second. But anyway, Evers steps on second first, and Hank O'Day says, I'll think about it, and goes back downtown to his hotel, and hours later decides, yeah, he was out. The game must be continued. And so this just creates a firestorm, as you might think. Picture this today. It was a terrible call. It was a terrible decision to reverse the habit of decades while not telling anybody but one guy on one team. I mean, there are a bunch of rules in baseball that just kind of evolved. You were never officially allowed to block the plate at home plate. The catcher was never officially allowed to do that, but they started doing it. So you can't suddenly do this, but he did, and they had to replay the game. The league president ruled, and they replayed it at the Polo Grounds. And this was kind of a riotous situation where the park was just mobbed by fans. The Cubs won, and afterwards had to literally kind of run for their lives. It was not New York's best moment, but the saddest victim of all this was Merkel, who, though McGraw, the manager, didn't blame him for it. In fact, upped his pay, really tried to cultivate him as his bench coach afterwards, played many years in the majors, but never got over this, never got over being hounded about this, and led this kind of sad, reclusive existence after he retired.
So very different than Christy Mathewson. Arguably the first Yankees star was Hal Chase. Who's Hal Chase?
Yes. Hal Chase was widely thought to be the greatest fielding first baseman ever at a time when that mattered a lot more. In the dead ball era, first baseman made all kinds of plays on the field. And he was apparently spectacular. On bunts, he would, he was known to, he'd run in, tag out the runner, and throw to third to get a runner out. Could do all kinds of things. Also, pretty good hitter as well. Would have been a sure Hall of Famer, but notoriously constantly corrupt, constantly fixing games or rumored to have fixed games, constantly approaching other players to fix games. It seemed to have been something in the blood. A teammate remarked on how he could never stop himself from stealing small items at newsstands when they were on the road, just swiping anything, trying to get away with anything. Terrific pool player, was kind of a pool hustler in his spare time, played the game constantly, played exhibitions when they weren't playing, but nobody trusted him. And, people would go around and yell, "Hey, Hal, what are the odds today?" But he was somehow able to constantly get away with this. Nobody could quite nail him, quite get the goods on him. And, in the end, this actually weirdly enough, led to Christy Mathewson's death, because Mathewson was managing the Cincinnati Reds, and Chase was on the team. And, Mathewson wanted him off the team, but he kept playing, kept throwing games. And finally, Mathewson said, "The hell with it," quit as manager and went to sign up for World War I, where he received a dose of poisonous gas in a training accident and became tubercular, died very young in the mid-20s after a long illness. So, he was really toxic, Chase. And he also was very involved, as I write in there, in helping to fix the 1919 World Series. He was kind of a key messenger in that. He's one of these guys who's just sort of bad news wherever he is, wherever he goes. And, just alienated himself from everybody eventually. So he paid for it. But a wonderful villain, if you have to have one,
Well, I want to get to the hero of the story now. Babe Ruth, he's larger than life. He seems like a myth. Do you have a favorite Babe Ruth story?
Oh, sure. It's like the thing Wade Hoyt said, that all the lies about Babe Ruth are true. Yeah, he is not the sort of guy you could have today. But probably my favorite Babe Ruth story is one I have in the book, where how Don Mattingly, when he's a rookie with the Yankees, he's in the Yankees clubhouse, and the clubhouse guy goes, "Oh, and there's Babe Ruth's locker." And Mattingly said, he's confirmed the story. "What do you mean? Babe Ruth was real?" It must have seemed like Paul Bunyan. Ruth was, just such a larger than life character. I think he's the most important professional athlete in history. Obviously, more people worldwide know who Michael Jordan is, or Muhammad Ali, or Pele, or a dozen other soccer players. But Ruth was the guy who really made baseball big time. When Ruth goes to the Yankees, baseball was much less lucrative than Broadway theater. There's a reason why Harry Frazee sold Ruth to the Yankees. He was a theater producer first, baseball owner second. Baseball was about as profitable as the sheet music business. And he brings in the first million-person season gate for the Yankees in New York. He first brings it into big time. He perfectly reflects the city and the time he was playing in. And he was great. He was a phenom. I think to this day, no one's matched him in the major leagues. Shohei Ohtani is a great player, but Ruth was like the best left-handed pitcher in baseball. Set a record for World Series scoreless innings. Turned around, became a hitter, and transformed the game. Set a record for home runs in a World Series. It's almost as if, great as Jordan was, if Jordan, after a few years, had become a center and scored so many points, they had to change the rules of basketball. One of the stories I like most about, there's so many great ones with Ruth, was how when the Yankees used to play in Philadelphia, the train would stop at North Street Station, and they would get out and walk a few blocks to Shibe Park. And the cry would go out, Babe Ruth is coming. And adults would run to the windows and look out, and kids would go running out and jump all over them. And he'd always arrive at the park with like a couple kids in his arms, someone hanging off his back. It's like when we had the hill gods instead of the sky gods. They were all the more thrilling because they walked among us. To see them was pretty incredible. And I think that's my favorite Ruth story.
So I give tours for Yankee Stadium. We are always told to be very neutral on whether he called the shot or not. But you have probably the most convincing account I've read that not only did he call a shot, but did it maybe twice.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He called the shot. I mean, to me, the debate is mysterious. Like they're, he wasn't pointing to the stands. He was pointing at the pitcher. He was saying something to the guy in the dugout, not to the. He's certainly pointing at something on film we have of it. And that alone, like who cares exactly where he's pointing? He's saying, I'm going to hit them all out of the park. You wait. I don't think there's any serious dispute about it. That was another amazing Ruth moment. You had Franklin Roosevelt running for president in the stands. And Gehrig comes up after him and hits another home run that gets no press. That was always Gehrig's fate. But that's an amazing, amazing moment too, for him to do this. The primary thing of the Yankees was to make money, primary objective, all professional sports teams. So they would schedule all these exhibition games every off day they could for Ruth to go into some cow town if there were enough fans, and there always were. And he'd go in, he'd pitch a few innings. He would lead the local band. Kids would jump all over him in the outfield. And he got paid very, very well. But this was this amazing kind of added pressure he was doing at the same time he was playing this incredible ball, And it seemed to occasionally got to him. There's a sad incident, I think, near the end of the 29 season where there's a sudden thunderstorm and this panicked run by fans out in the stands, out in right field or the bleachers, and this poor young woman gets kind of trampled and badly in need of medical attention. And he actually goes out and carries her to the dugout, and this doctor looks her over, and she expires there. And he's just bereft at that. And he has to take like a couple weeks off, and then he's back to being Babe Ruth. But this is what he was too, this kind of underneath all the crazy carousing and drinking what he could, sleeping, there was this kind of tender person too, who had been all but abandoned by his parents growing up, and yet was a good guy.
So at the same time that the Babe is doing his feats, there's another guy who's doing similar things who doesn't, and I can tell you from Immaculate Grid, people do not really know who Martin Dihigo is.
Yeah, and that's a shame too, because he's the one guy who there were more pitchers turned hitters than we realized at the time. But yes, he's the one guy who may have been as great as Ruth. Martin Dihigo was a Cuban-born player who played in the Negro Leagues in America because he was a black man and was not allowed in Major League Baseball. And, as was the case with many black players at the time, you would play in the United States during the summer, and then you'd go play in Cuba and Mexico. He's the only man I know of in 3 halls of fame: the Mexican, Cuban, and American baseball halls of fame. And he was a very good pitcher who only seemed to get better as he went on. And he was also a terrific hitter. Hit for power, stole bases, and he could play almost anywhere on the field, and did. There are all these debates about, could it be that the greatest team played before the color line was broken? Could it be this, and was Major League Baseball really that good if black players weren't allowed? Babe Ruth hit something like 455 in recorded games against black teams. So there were a lot of good players in the majors who were good in any case. There's no need to kind of run them down. The people who really suffered from this were these great black and Hispanic players who were not allowed to make anywhere near like the money they would have made, who were not allowed to have anything like the fame they would have had. And it's all the rest of us who suffered from not getting to see them play. That's the real tragedy there. And that's another thing that's rotten about segregation and the old segregated America.
So this is something I didn't know until I read your book, but on June 15th, 1938, it was the first night game in New York. What happens that night?
Yeah. First night game in New York, in Brooklyn, and Johnny Vandermeer, pitcher for the Reds, becomes the only man to pitch 2 no-hitters in a row to this day. Full house at Ebbets Field. FDR pushes a button in the White House that puts the lights on there. A lot of Vandermeer's relatives are in the stands. They've been bussed in because he's from New Jersey, so they come in to see this. Great moment. Of course, the game, because the Dodgers owners, particularly a guy named Larry McPhail, because he's determined to get as many fans as possible in there, they keep delaying the game. It's to get a late start. Vandermeer warms up 4 or 5 times, and he's a little wild by the time the game starts. But he goes ahead, he pitches the second no-hitter. It's a wild thing. And I believe Red Barber, it was not, for some reason the game was not being broadcast. So he was at home that night, but he recreated the 9th inning for some kind of special occasion, and that was that was a terrific thing. So we actually have the old redhead recording that. But it was a great moment, and people, there were all these ridiculous. Baseball really should have gone to night baseball, like at least a decade, maybe 2 decades earlier. Black teams were already playing under the lights. There was all these silly fears about, fans it would make them too agitated. They wouldn't be able to sleep when they went home, and then they would be no good the next day. Things like this. So they go crazy. So this was way too long in coming, but it was a good thing when it came. And boy, this meant working people could go and see games at night.
Was there a person that you found a soft spot or became especially interested in the book?
I find Mathewson very interesting. The fact that he's this guy who was able to adjust his image and it talked in interesting ways. Like he once told a sports writer about how you have to have a good alibi. You have to have an alibi to tell yourself as to why you failed in any situation. And that struck me as really counterintuitive. We think of our superstars as always, no excuses, get out there and do it. Interesting that a great star wanted to have something in the back of his mind to excuse his failures so he could go on. He was a complex guy, but there are so many people in this, though, who are just amazing. I mean, Casey Stengel, who's all through this book, who's all through, New York baseball history. Fantastic character. Bugsy McGraw is a very interesting character. Somebody who had terrible tragedies in his life, but ended up sort of beloved in New York. There's a just an amazing cavalcade of personalities, of stars, of characters. There was a guy, Ox Eckhart, who was a big Pacific Coast League star. Great hitter there. He came east to play with the Dodgers, and insisted on bringing this huge St. Bernard with him everywhere, and was told that the dog would have to go. And he said, if the dog goes, I go. And so he hit about 182 for the next month, and soon ox and dog were gone. A lot of characters of that sort, that are fun to talk about too.
I became a big fan of Pete Reiser.
They say the warning track was started for because he tended to just run straight into walls, chasing balls in the outfield. Great player for the Dodgers. He was kind of called, Brooklyn's DiMaggio, and a great five-skill player, very fast, hit for power, fantastic outfielder. But he kept getting injured in all sorts of ways, and he kept running into walls. It really shortened his career. He's one of the great tragedies. Maybe it shouldn't be surprising for the time, but there is a surprising number of players who die young. It was a very different era. But there are people like Urban Shocker, who had this heart condition. Greatest baseball name ever. But he's a terrific pitcher, a near Hall of Fame pitcher, but has this heart condition. And after being a star in the 27 Yankees rotation, dies the next year. A guy named Jumbo Orr, who played for the old New York Metropolitan, and then in the Players League in the 19th century. As the name implies, he was somewhat overweight, but not gigantically. Has a stroke at 30, never able to play again, dies a few years later. These were players coming out of kind of the tough working life America of the time. You had a star pitcher on the Cubs, Mordecai Three Finger Brown, who was called that because he had lost three fingers in a farming accident. He asked if he would have been as good a pitcher with the fingers, and he said, "I don't know." Just the only answer you can give. They reflected kind of this much harder America that was all around them too.
Is there a game or a moment that you wish you could have witnessed?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, I mean, the Merkel game or the replay, would have been incredible to witness. It would have been amazing to witness, even though the Yankees lost. Would have been amazing to see old Pete Alexander come out of the bullpen and strike out Tony Lazzari in the 26 World Series. Ruth's called shot would have been an amazing game to witness. The game in 41 when in the Yankees-Dodgers first Subway Series, when Mickey Owen lets the third strike get past him, and the Yankees rally to win from 7-4, and they rallied and score 4 runs in the ninth after they should have been out. So many of these moments that you read about all the time would have been great to see.
I thought of this just before we started, but I'm pretty sure that the 2010s were the first decade that a New York team did not make the World Series. Are we currently in the worst period of New York baseball?
I think we are close to the worst period in New York sports, period.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a horrible moment in like 1966 where, almost every New York team finished last or next to last, but now, we just don't seem to win much anymore. And this is a bad period for New York baseball. And it reflects, the ownership, I think, in both cases. Which is not, more than ever, not willing to kind of go outside the boundaries of the modern game. They're very accepting of the salary cap. They're very accepting of, playing within the boundaries of what all of Major League Baseball wants. And I think that's a shame. And I think it'll hurt the sport in this city as we go forward. What's ridiculous is that the amount of tax money we subsidize our teams with, and to which they react by doing things like cutting down the number of seats in the park so they can have more luxury boxes. That's absurd and wrong and should never have been allowed to happen. So, so we'll see. But, New York sports team, New York baseball teams, sports teams anywhere in general do not have a long record of owners who cared a fig for the fans. So, so I don't know if this is any different, but it should change.
That was Kevin Baker, author of The New York Game, which is out now. And to close us out, we have Dana Yost reading his poem on Babe Ruth from our latest issue.
Ruth talks hitting. It's a young Ruth, slimmer, certainly not the caricatured fat man. He's wearing a Yankees uniform, pinstriped but with no logo except for the overlaid NY on the cap. He's showing a man in a suit and fedora something with his bat, cradling it near the trademark as if to say, "This is the sweet spot where I hit them the best, the farthest." The man in the fedora, maybe a New York sports writer, looks on intently, but with a slight smile. perhaps picturing one of Ruth's majestic clouts into the far reaches of the stadium. They're in front of the Yankees dugout, probably pre-game, and I wish I had been there, eavesdropping, or even in the midst of the conversation, listening in as greatness explains what it means, what it takes to be great, how it feels to become legendary. Did Ruth hit a homer later in that game, the one in the photograph? Did he find the sweet spot that day? I want to say yes. I want to say that he slugged one beyond the limit of sight, the ball falling like a rocket, landing with a racket, so loud, oh God, so loud, in the seats, or maybe deeper, rattling around an outfield concourse. I want to say that is how it happened. I want to say Ruth was Ruth, and the bat was sweet, and so was the swing. And so was the swing, then and forever.
Thanks for listening. You can support the Lit Mag and the podcast on Patreon. Until next time,